At the American Advertising Federation, our mission is to protect and promote the well-being of advertising. We accomplish this through a unique nationally coordinated grassroots network of advertisers, agencies, media companies, local advertising clubs, and college chapters. The American Advertising Federation's virtual day at the Texas Capitol welcomes Clark Rector, Executive Vice President, Government Affairs, the American Advertising Federation.
One of the constants in Washington, D.C. that we deal with is the chance of being taxed. We are constantly looking at a Congress that is looking for new sources of revenue. And when they do look for new sources of revenue, advertising is often one of the things they look at. If nothing else, we're very early in the alphabet, so alphabetically we come up first. But it's at the federal level, it's looking at the reduction of the deductibility of advertising. Advertising, as everybody knows, is 100% deductible as a normal and necessary business expense. And over the years, there have been multiple attempts to reduce that, either by eliminating part of it or amortizing a part of the deduction. As recently as 2017, the last major tax reform bill, we know from people who were in the room, advertising deductibility was discussed as a way to try and fund that tax reform. Thankfully, it did not happen at the time. Earlier than that, showing that this is a bipartisan issue in 2013-14, the then chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and House Ways and Means Committee, one a Democrat, one a Republican, both introduced comprehensive tax reform bills, and they both included a tax on advertising tax deductibility. What those bills would have done is both of them would have limited the industry to a 50% deduction in the year that the expense was incurred, but then would have required the rest of it to be amortized. They would have allowed the full deduction, but they would have amortized the remaining 50% over either 5 or 10 years, under the theory that an advertisement that is bought today is still bringing value to the customer 5 or 10 years down the road. Obviously, we know that is, in technical terms, nuts, but that's the kind of mindset that we're dealing with when sometimes dealing with some of these folks who are looking at going after advertising at the federal level. So tax issues are not limited just to the federal government, but to state governments as well. And states are looking at new media as ways to try and raise revenue. In particular, big tech. Big tech has been under attack by the governments and both the federal and the state levels. And at the state, my home state of Maryland has actually passed a tax on digital advertising. It is being challenged in the courts, but when legislators are looking to raise revenue and they're looking to punish big tech, and as you know, that tech is being attacked from both the left and the right, this is an area where all of that comes together. It's the sweet spot for folks trying to raise money or to punish big tech. Quite frankly, the main proponent of this tax in Maryland didn't care about raising money. He just wanted to punish the companies that the big tech companies that they felt were doing evil. He had a misconception that targeted advertising was something that was bad, and we just take exception to that whole precedent. We think it's something that benefits consumers because the consumers are getting information they're more likely to be interested in, and it very much benefits the advertiser as well because they're able to reach the consumers with the responsible use of data who are more likely to be interested in their advertising. Well, at the federal level, they try and raise money through reduction on the deductibility of advertising. It's a little bit different at the state level. At the state, an ad tax is really an expansion of the state sales tax to include advertising purchases, whether it's the purchase of advertising services from an agency or the time and space from the media. We have fought these things over the years in well over half the states, 35 to 40 states over the years. Back in 1987, Florida actually passed an advertising tax along with a few other services, and it was such a disaster, they repealed it after 6 months. The cost of advertising went up, the amount of advertising went down. It ended up having ripple effects, fewer sales tax revenue because there weren't as many goods. The media obviously suffered very much, lots and lots of jobs lost. And actually lots of jobs lost among the legislators who voted for that. Also, after it was repealed in the next elections, a lot of the supporters lost their jobs. Despite that, there's a lot of hubris out in legislator land. State legislators always think they can do something better. So we've seen lots and lots of proposals come up since then. None of them have passed, thanks in large part to AAF members in the various states who have fought these things at the state level. And if it happens, we have lots of examples from Florida, lots of good talking points, but it's another one of those perennial issues that's there. As long as there's a need for money, legislators are going to be looking at new and different ways to try and raise it. And taxes on advertising are something that come up because they feel like they're taxing a business, not consumers. They don't understand the trickle-down effects that will happen because consumers do suffer also. As we're talking to lawmakers at both the federal and state levels, one of our most important messages is the value of advertising to the economy and to jobs, to consumers, and to businesses. And we have done what we can to try and demonstrate this through hard numbers, through an economic study. It's a study that was originally designed by a Nobel Prize winning economist, Lawrence Klein, who won it in 1980. So it's a very substantial and valid study, and we've just updated some of the numbers, and they're really eye-opening, showing the value of advertising to the economy. For instance, these are the US numbers. Advertising supported $7.1 trillion of US output. That's 19.4% of the economy. Every dollar of advertising supports on average about $21 of economic output. The total impact of advertising represented 18.5% of US gross domestic product. And for every $1 million spent on advertising, 83 American jobs are supported across a broad range of industries, not just the advertising industry. And every direct advertising job supports another 51 jobs across all industries. And they're good paying jobs too. The average salary for jobs supported by advertising is over $73,000 a year. So that's 12% above the national average. But it's not just on the national level. Advertising supports jobs in the economy in Texas as well. In Texas, it supported in 2020, 17.7% of economic activity. Each dollar spent supported about $24 in economic output, and advertising helped support 18% of Texas jobs. And each advertising job in Texas supports another 50 jobs across all industries. So advertising is very, very important to our market economy. And part of our job is to tout the benefits of the advertising to lawmakers and policymakers at the state and the federal level. One of the nice things about the study is that it shows how strong the industry is and how it's actually growing. In Texas, for example, when I talked about advertising in 2020, supporting 17.7% economic activity. That's up from 15% in 2015. Similarly, as to the number of jobs supported, 18% in 2020, it's up from about 14.5% in 2015. So advertising just continues to grow in importance to the US and to the Texas economy. Looking ahead and looking at these numbers, I think that we're looking at an industry that is strong and it's going to stay strong and will only continue to grow. Remember that a lot of the growth that we saw in 2020 came as we were going into the pandemic. And so there was a concern that there might be a diminution of what's happening with the industry, that it just continues to expand. It's as long as we remain in a market economy, as long as there are goods and services that businesses want to provide to consumers, they're going to need to continue to communicate with consumers. And as new media grows and there are new ways to be able to target responsibly consumers with interest-based advertising, I'm just very bullish on the ability of advertisers to do their job on behalf of their clients. Well, AAF is a grassroots organization. It's what sets us apart from the other associations here in Washington, D.C. There's the old saying that all politics is local, which is referring to the grassroots. It's lawmakers, the elected ones especially, want to hear from their constituents about the issues of importance. They're there to represent them. They're also there to get reelected. So they need to know what the people who can vote for and against them are thinking about. And the AAF grassroots is a great way to do that for the advertising industry. The way to do that is to go in and let them know about the positives of the industry. Let them know about the economic numbers that we have. You can do that through email. You can do that by having those members participate in some of your club activities. If you're doing public service, if you're doing the American Advertising Awards, or let them know what's going on with your supporting scholarships and things of that nature. There are so many positive things that the advertising industry does, and the ad clubs do beyond just the jobs and the economic data that we talked about, that those lawmakers need to know about. They need to know that this is an industry that has a positive force. And through events like this, the Day in the Capitol, it's a chance for you to learn those talking points, but then to turn around and to make sure that your lawmakers, your representatives are aware of what's happening, whether it's in the Capitol or whether it's back home in the home districts. Well, the best way to approach a legislator and to talk to a legislator is the same as you would talk to any client in a business relationship. You're wanting to put yourself as an authoritative voice, somebody that they can trust. You're building a relationship. Much of what we're doing here with passing on the data about the jobs, the economy, the things that the clubs are doing, are establishing that relationship with your lawmakers, so that if an issue comes up and you talk to them, then you are a trusted source of information already. It's just like doing sales. You rarely make a sale on a cold call the first time that you pick up the phone or walk in the door and talk to somebody. But once you have established a relationship, shown that you are a source of trusted information, then you can make the sale. It's the same way with talking to lawmakers. As you become a source of trusted information, when you talk to them, when an issue does come up within the Capitol of concern to the industry, you're a trusted source of information. As you leave the event, as you move forward, taking what you have learned from the various speakers, myself and others, and you're dealing with the lawmakers, you're dealing with policymakers, be it your local mayor, city council, state legislator, or even a member of Congress. One thing you need to remember as you're talking about things of interest to you is that you are actually the experts. You're the source of information. You're going in and talking about advertising, the business that you know. You're educating them about the importance of the work that we all do. I used to work for a member of Congress, and we'd have constituents or representatives from various industries coming in. And just as you may have a degree of nervousness going in, talking to an elected official, it goes the other way too, because my boss would say, this person is coming from such and such industry. I don't know anything about that. And they'd want to get the background. So you're going in and you're the expert. You're the ones talking about what you know, your business and advertising and all of the good things that the industry and that the club does to benefit not just your clients, but consumers as well. I want you to remember as you're going forth from this event that you are not working alone, that you have a local and national association supporting you and behind you. Not only your local ag club, but you've got AAF in Washington, D.C. If you ever find yourself in Washington, look us up and come by and say hi. If you ever need something, don't hesitate to pick up the phone or email and call us and let us know what we can do to help. That's what we're there for. And I want you to remember also that we have events that you're more than welcome to participate in. And in fact, if you're enjoying this in the state capitol later this month on March 17th, we're doing a national virtual day on the Hill. You can find out more about it at aaf.org, but I would encourage you to register for that as well. We would love to have you take part in that. And at any time, don't forget that we are there to help you out, and you're always welcome to reach out to any of us on the AAF staff. That's what we're there for. We are your national association. So enjoy the rest of your day here, and I hope to see you at our event on March 17th, AAF's Advertising Day on the Hill.
You are a part of the American Advertising Federation's virtual day at the Texas Capitol. Please welcome Mike Signorelli, partner at Venable LLC.
So I know privacy is on top of mind for all Americans, and particularly for this audience and where they are in the intersection of advertising and meeting customer client demand. So I think the question is, where are we right now as a nation on a policy level and as an industry on data privacy and whether or not we're expecting regulations? And there's not a clear answer. I think that there is continued momentum building towards a national standard. But today we're still on a state-by-state approach with 3 states with more comprehensive legislation in play. But there are dozens of states that are so close to enacting legislation. And unfortunately, there's not a single approach. We're seeing a patchwork developing. Even where there are states where there's commonality in approach, the definitions and the operationalization of those laws will have distinct meanings for businesses that operate nationally. So I think we'll continue to see a debate, particularly in Congress. I know there's a series of hearings coming up in the next couple of weeks, one in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, looking at big tech data issues. But we're no closer to resolution than we were a year ago, or even with the passage of the California Privacy Act. So the question is, what is the AAF and the broader industry doing today to help on this debate? And I work closely with your Washington representative, Clark Rector, on these issues. And he is very active across all the states and in Congress, educating policymakers and trying to explain what are the reasonable data standards for regulating this industry, ensuring that consumers can still derive the benefit of an open, competitive digital ecosystem, and ensuring businesses still can engage in responsible ways. And so AAF is on the forefront now in many states, advocating on data privacy. I know you'll be talking about ad tax issues, so they're across all the issues that are important to its membership, and drum beating the constant, we need a national standard. We need a preemptive federal law that sets baseline protections for consumers, but sets reasonable practices so that business can appropriately operationalize those nationwide. So covering and talking about how the broader ecosystem and the self-regulatory programs like the Digital Advertising Alliance and programs put out by Interactive Advertising Bureau and other associations, how are they building momentum? And they're still all very active and part of the broader advocacy approach and education approach. DAA is continuing to offer its principles-based approach of enhanced notice and control for the collection of data for targeted advertising. It's expanded its program over the last decade into new areas. Now common practices like mobile, but in 2013, when they put out their guidance, this was cutting edge guidance, but it's gone further. It's gone to political ad disclosures. They're working on connected device guidance today. And they're also helping develop frameworks for addressable media identifiers to ensure that businesses can continue to engage in an addressable manner with consumers online, and that engagement can be both beneficial for consumers and businesses. So the top 5 privacy considerations, these were conversations I'm having with clients and policymakers. It's around one, is there a legislative approach? Can we get a national standard to set a baseline competitive marketplace that serves consumers and businesses? Another area of attention is around addressability. There's been efforts by some gatekeepers to change the way that businesses can interact, the use of cookies or the use of mobile ad IDs to engage with consumers. There's new restrictions imposed on businesses' ability to leverage those identifiers. How do we ensure that there's an independent identity so that rich, vibrant internet can continue to operate as it has, but in a way that's still respective of consumers and making sure that it's a beneficial exchange interaction for them? Those are really the top 2. I mean, from there's questions about how do you operationalize these new requirements in California, Virginia, Colorado that have assessment requirements, audit requirements, new rights requirements, which is, I think, probably 3, 4, and 5 on that list. If I'm a business, what do I do when I get a rights request from a consumer out of state? How do I manage and provide them access to information? What's covered in that access request? How do I provide opt-outs in California versus Virginia? What should I know about what's happening in Texas and Massachusetts and New York? How do I build a compliance program that I can have that operates seamlessly across the country? So the question about how likely it is that there'll be a patchwork of laws and how would that affect businesses? I think it's very likely. Right now, there are 4 states with data privacy specific laws. They're California, Colorado, Virginia, and Nevada, which is a little bit more narrow than the other 3. But last year we had close to 40 states considering legislation, and not all of them took the same approach. And this year we're probably close to 30, only 2 months in, where there are states considering different privacy legislation. And I think we could say that they're taking an approach where it's rights-based. So consumers have the right to request access to their information, the right to delete their information, the right to opt out of certain processing and use of that information. And on its face, that sounds like there is harmonization coming to America from state to state. But the way that the terms are defined, who is subject to these rights, who may make a rights request, differs. For example, in California, a consumer or an individual with rights, a person in California, is a person, a resident, an employee, a business contact. So you're looking at consumer household data as well as professional data. So if I had a sales lead and I was using that lead to make a pitch, that person that I was talking to has rights under the California law. Now, those rights are exempt until the end of this year. But in 2023, with the new privacy law coming into effect in California, that exemption sunsets. So now you have to think about operationalizing your compliance program for employee data, B2B data, where you don't have to do that in Colorado and Virginia. So the definitions, the way that the rights are defined do matter. And we're seeing other states take an entirely different approach to privacy. Some are approaching it maybe like a buffet type style. Maybe I'll take a little bit of California, I'll take a little bit from the GDPR. Maybe I'll just come up with my own flavor, put a little sauce on the top, and we have an entirely different law or a different proposal. And we've seen that play out in this idea of automated settings, like global privacy controls, those opt-outs set through browsers. Some states have adopted that with showing that there's safeguards and protections to make sure that the way that those are set, they're not on by default. The consumer actually has to make a choice. The consumer has to be informed about the effect of those choices. That is a reasonable way to provide consumer control. Other states don't have those protections and just say, whatever the signal is, you have to honor it. And they're not limiting it to honoring it for opting out of targeted advertising or maybe sales. We've seen proposals where there are automated signals for data deletion or do not collect. If you think about the do not collect concept, the proposal has no exemptions, no exceptions to the rule. So if you see a signal, and again, this is just a proposal, it's not law, I don't make anyone nervous, but just so you have an idea of what Clark and I are dealing with in the states on a day-to-day basis and the different proposals, I think it's important to spend a little time and think about this. If you see a do not collect signal and there's no exception to it, that means you can't collect data from a browser, can't collect it through an app. So if you're operating a website, you need basic user agent information just to render the website. And if those exceptions aren't permissible, you can't even return a website when someone comes and visits. So it's those are the types of things that are troubling. Those are the things that I think make the debate more challenging. And coupled with that, we are seeing a drive to include private rights of action, which would be a boom for the plaintiffs bar, allowing for private plaintiffs to sue for any technical violation of the law. You know, if you are required to return a rights request within 45 days and it takes you 46 days, you know, that would be grounds for a lawsuit. And that does not set up reasonable practices nor a reasonable market to operate in. So as it relates to privacy and maybe Congress's role and whether or not they'll get engaged, that continues to be the hope. Would like to see Congress set a baseline national standard that's preemptive, that would set practices and standards that are based on reasonable data practices, engage in responsible, reasonable data practices. Those would be permitted, subject to notice, identifying specific practices that should be prohibited, you know, using data to stalk, that should be flatly prohibited, using data to commit fraud, flatly prohibited, those sort of kind of clear green light, red light practices. Giving the FTC more robust enforcement authority tied to enforcing these standards, making sure that they're the top cop on the beat. Those are things that would be helpful. Unfortunately, I mean, just where we are right now in the legislative cycle, the midterms coming up, and the agenda and the issues facing our nation, there are higher priority items that we're seeing come to the forefront and the floor for debate at Congress. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role for it to continue to do education, to continue to advocate for this. And hopefully in 2023, we'll see some real momentum. I'm confident that this year we'll see some momentum, some hearings happening in the springtime, looking more at some of these issues and trying to move the debate forward. I mean, really the lines have been around preemption. This is in the congressional debate, and private right of action. Should Congress set a baseline ceiling or floor when it comes to data privacy? I think, you know, almost all Americans, and the polling is in the high 80%, say that they want a federal law. I think most members of Congress would agree that it's time for a federal privacy law. But whether or not Congress should preempt states or allow states to add to that. So setting a floor, allowing the states to go above. And the problem with that is we're back into the state by state patchwork approach. And the other question is the enforcement. Is it vested in the Federal Trade Commission and state attorney generals, or do you allow for a private right of action? I mean, a question of whether or not we'll see a ban on advertising and limits on advertising to mobile devices. My sense is no. We won't see a flat prohibition. I mean, this is protected commercial speech under the First Amendment. There may be limits and restraints put on the types of advertising and how advertising may be engaged, but there should not be a flat prohibition. But that does not mean that there are not attempts to do that. In the last couple months, we have seen proposals put forward to ban advertising outright, types of advertising, what is called surveillance advertising, which is a negative connotation intentionally to disparage the type of advertising where it's inference-based, identifying trends and then delivering advertising based on inferences of what businesses would think would be most relevant at the most relevant time to consumers. And there was a proposal submitted to the Federal Trade Commission asking the FTC to exercise its authority on unfair methods of competition to outright ban targeted advertising. That process just kicked off in end of January, with comments being filed by industry companies explaining the true value of data, the value of advertising, how it enriches the consumer experience, how it's more efficient, how it's actually privacy protective through programs like the DAA, and saying that there may be a need for baseline privacy legislation through Congress, but not an outright ban. And then a few weeks later, we saw a proposal introduced in Congress calling for the banning of this type of advertising, again, in both the Senate and House. And there's a hearing coming up in a short amount of time that will examine this bill, and it'll get its hearing, and we'll see where it goes. I think these proposals go too far. For example, when they talk about targeted advertising, it's not limited to what we think of when we say targeted advertising. The collection of data across non-affiliated digital properties over time. And with some of the proposals we're seeing, in particular the one before Congress, the breadth of the bill would reach some very common marketing and advertising practices. For instance, the way that the definitions, and going back to the point about definitions matter in this context, it could capture practices like zip code based targeted advertising. So if you're a local car dealership and you're trying to reach residents in your local area about an upcoming sale, President's Day weekend, and trying to encourage people to come test drive a car, this bill, should it become law, could prohibit that. And again, these are very common practices, using zip code or location-based advertising to reach certain DMAs in the marketplace and make sure that you're more efficient with your marketing and reaching people again at the relevant time, the relevant place, with the relevant information. That could be precluded by these types of proposals. So global privacy and the sort of different approaches taken in different jurisdictions around the world do appear to be confusing. And I think that when you're looking at an issue about privacy, it tends to be a personal view on what is appropriate for allowing access to behavior, interests, and using that information for advertising purposes. And in the United States, we tend to focus on major categories of advertising, CPG, auto, travel, things along those lines, and put more restrictive approaches on data types that may be sensitive about our movement. So consent for the collection of location data, limits on health data. You can't use health records, but if you're using health interest data, some industry codes require consent. So putting heightened safeguards around the data type. And those are, even in the United States, we're not, I think, single-minded on what's the right boundary, but for the majority of people, I think we've struck the right balance. That becomes even more challenging when we go from nation to nation, because cultural and just local norms of what's privacy really does vary from country to country. And to think that we could have a single global law and understanding what privacy means and how it could be played out is very challenging. And I think the best we can hope for and what we could try to achieve is interoperability, ensuring that there are consistent standards applying to data when it moves from nation to nation. So transparency is, I think, a sort of a universal truth when it comes to privacy, that we should be transparent about our practices, how we're going to use that information. We should provide appropriate control, and there's certain data and certain uses that are off limits, but particularly that use is subject to local law. So in the United States, we have sectorial laws about using health records. And I said for the self-regulatory codes, it's off limits, absent the proper permissions under something like HIPAA. Then we have restrictions on the use of data for eligibility determinations. So the data should be used in that way. But I think if we're trying to align, and particularly with our partners in Europe, I think we need to make sure that we're providing some consistency based on what we do here in the United States around those traditional FIPS principles of transparency and control and limits on onward transfer, so that there's consistency from one side to the other. So how would a business set a policy and manage the distinctions from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction? I'll tell you, that's what we do at Venable every day, is helping our clients manage those risks. And there's not an off-the-shelf product that I think that will work for every single business around the world. And you really have to start with looking and doing a data map or an inventory of your data, how you're using it, the sources of that data, the rights that you have when you're collecting it, and understand the life cycle of the data from collection, use, and transfer. And then layering on top of that, the rights, the requirements, the obligations under law. Again, there is some commonality from state to state and country to country. The ideas of control, access, transparency, deletion, correction, those sort of principles we're seeing in many different jurisdictions. But how you effectuate those, you're going to have a program that either is nuanced to deal with state to state, or you're going to pick the most rigorous requirement and apply that globally where you can. And there may be some distinctions where there is conflict about, for instance, an access request in one state, may not be covering the same scope of data in another state. There are some limits on what you can return back to individuals upon their request. So while one law may be more expansive, give everything, another state says you can't give everything because it raises security risks. So you're still going to have those nuances programmed into your compliance program. But you have to start first with that inventory of data, and then you're going to map that against the compliance obligations. And then you're going to recognize that there will be nuances and exceptions that you're going to have to apply on a jurisdictional basis. So enforcement's a key part of any sort of legislative or regulatory approach. And so how do you go about enforcing policies? And there are many different ways to do enforcement. And some of them I think are more beneficial to consumers and produce more predictability in the market versus those that are more punitive and enrich certain stakeholders, but don't necessarily improve the marketplace for consumers or businesses. And I would draw the lines onto who are the individuals who may enforce. We have many federal laws that bestow the enforcement authority in federal agencies and allow for joint enforcement with state attorney generals. So a common enforcement regime would be enforcement by the Federal Trade Commission. We've seen this under things like the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, where the FTC has main enforcement authority and may bring enforcement actions. We also see them partnering even under COPPA with state attorney generals. And that allows for the federal government and state governments to work together to enforce, to bring about enforcement actions against companies that violate the law. And many times they have civil penalty authority. But what it does is it really brings predictability in the marketplace. It allows a business to understand how the federal government and state governments interpret these laws, and it allows them to better manage their compliance obligations under law versus laws that allow for private rights of action. It was very common under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, the TCPA, to allow for private causes of actions by private citizens. And we've seen where there has been lawsuits resulting in billion-dollar awards of damages to plaintiffs' counsel, who are finding the most technical violation of the law and bringing lawsuit. That does not bring around compliance. That brings around not engaging. It results in business not innovating, not engaging in certain practices when the laws are meant to regulate how you do that, not create a chilling effect. And the TCPA had a chilling effect on the marketplace. And you find that, and there's many studies of the damages awarded, it's pennies on the dollar that actually goes to the consumer as a redress. So it doesn't necessarily provide any tangible benefits to consumers. It ties up our courts. It's a tax on business that doesn't provide predictability because it's all really related to what a particular case finds, what is settled. It doesn't necessarily lead to the law of the land. So a better approach is through enforcement by the Federal Trade Commission and state attorney generals, because it does result in, I think, better results for consumers and businesses. Speaking to how individuals can get involved in sort of the messaging they should be thinking about when they do engage in the political process. And I think it's just simply being truthful. And no one can do a better job advocating for your interests than yourself, because you're passionate, you believe it, you know it, and you have a great story to tell. So I think the greatest hurdle is finding a way to get engaged. And I know AAF does a fantastic job through its network of local clubs to bring these issues to them, to have conversations and debate these topics, and finding ways for them to get engaged in the political process. I know in the state advocacy work that we do, we regularly have local clubs sign on to our letters and participate in the process. And then we do find ways when there are opportunities for public hearings in local state capitals to reach out to local clubs and have members come and actually testify. I mean, it may sound scary to say you're testifying, but it's giving public comment. It's standing up, it's going to the microphone and stating your case and explaining who you are and what you do in the market, that you're a citizen of the state, you care very much about the state, you have clients here, you work here, you add value to the community, and you do that through advertising, and you're responsible, you're a good actor, and that you believe in the use of data to enrich the digital experience, whether that's on mobile, web, or out of home. Finding ways to engage and talking to them, letting them know how you do that. And you do it responsibly. You're using data for specific purposes, and that's to deliver advertising to the right audience at the right time and in the right place. And all these parades of horrors of nefarious acts, that's not what you're doing. You're responsible business people. And you're very trusting of that relationship. You're very concerned in making sure that relationship that you have with your clients and customers is respected and maintained. You have every incentive to make sure that you don't violate that trust. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I feel like I'm a regular of this event, and I do appreciate the partnership with AAF and the local clubs, and including me to talk with you about what's going on with data privacy in states across the nation and around the world. So best of luck today, and hope you guys have a great show.
We invite you to get involved. Join your local AAF chapter. For more information, visit AAF/National Government Affairs at aaf.org.